At my granddaughter's birthday dinner, my own son told me I wasn't welcome at the table. He said I'd abandoned the family. His wife smirked, agreeing while my granddaughter looked down, ashamed. I stayed quiet, just smiling. Weeks later, my granddaughter held up a hidden letter from her grandfather that shattered their lies. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. The April sun pressed warmly against Marguerite Hale's back as she approached the Grand Country Club, her hand gripping her purse tightly as if it were the only anchor she had left. Inside that purse lay a small, carefully wrapped package, something she had been saving for this very day. At 65, she had learned to cling to moments of connection, fragile and fleeting as they often were. Today was Sophia's 15th birthday, a milestone Margaret had convinced herself could be a turning point, a chance for reconciliation with the granddaughter she had all but lost to the lies that had grown in her absence. She paused at the heavy glass doors, smoothed the skirt of the soft blue dress she had purchased for the occasion, and drew a steadying breath. The dress was meant to signal effort, respect, dignity, a small gesture of hope that this day could be different. She stepped inside, and at once the scene struck her with its beauty and cruelty. The hall shimmered with pink and silver decorations. A DJ adjusted equipment in the corner. Waiters moved elegantly between clusters of chatting guests, trays of hors d'oeuvres glinting in the light. Margaret scanned the crowd, her heart leaping when she spotted her son, Daniel, standing beside his wife, Victoria. They were deep in conversation, absorbed in their own world. For a fleeting moment, Margaret's heart ached with longing. If only they would look up and see her, not as an intruder, not as the villain they painted her to be, but as a mother and grandmother simply trying to come home. Her fingers brushed against the package in her purse. Perhaps, just perhaps, today would be the day. Then she saw it, suspended above the gift table, in bold, deliberate strokes. A banner declared, "Go away, you old resentful woman." The words burned through her chest like acid. She froze, every muscle trembling, her face flooding with heat as conversations faltered and eyes turned toward her. This was no accident, no misguided prank. This was humiliation crafted with precision, hung where everyone could witness the spectacle of her disgrace. "Mother," Daniel's voice cut across the silence. He stood a few feet away, arms crossed, his face an unforgiving wall. "I'm surprised you actually came." Margaret swallowed, forcing strength into her trembling voice. "It's my granddaughter's birthday. Of course I came." Victoria appeared at Daniel's side, her smile sharper than glass. "We were clear about the family's wishes, Margaret, especially after what you did." "What I did?" The words clawed at Margaret's throat, but she already knew the story they had rehearsed so carefully. In their version, she had abandoned them out of spite when Richard died. In reality, she had uncovered lies in the vineyard's finances, confronted Daniel, and in return had been cast out, her integrity shattered, her stability questioned. "I just want to wish Sophia a happy birthday," Margaret said, drawing her shoulders back. "I brought her a gift." "A gift?" Victoria laughed, brittle and hollow. "Another attempt to poison her against us? She doesn't need your gifts or your stories." Margaret's gaze swept the room until she found her granddaughter. Sophia stood radiant in a flowing pink dress, surrounded by her friends, looking older than her years. For a heartbeat, Margaret allowed herself the fragile hope of recognition, of warmth. Their eyes met across the room, and Sophia's expression hardened as though rehearsed. She excused herself from her circle of friends and walked forward, her every step deliberate. "Grandma," Sophia said at last. The word was sharp, foreign on her tongue. "Happy birthday, Sophia," Margaret managed, her voice cracking under the weight of longing. "You look beautiful." "Why are you here?" The girl's tone was cold, distant, her young face twisted by words that were not her own. "You abandoned us, and now you show up pretending to care." The words struck Margaret like blows. This was not her granddaughter speaking. These were Victoria's accusations, planted and nourished for years. "That's not the truth, Sophia. I never—" "Save it." Sophia's voice rose, slicing the air between them. "Mom and Dad told me everything. After Grandpa died, you just walked away because you couldn't stand seeing Dad take over. You've been bitter ever since." Around them, whispers rustled like dry leaves. Guests leaned closer, savoring the spectacle of family unraveling in public. "Please, Sophia," Margaret whispered. "That isn't what happened." "Just go," Sophia shouted, her voice rising above the chatter. "You're ruining my party just like you ruined everything else." Daniel placed a firm hand on his daughter's shoulder, the gesture protective yet possessive. "You heard her, Mother. It's best if you leave." For a moment, Margaret stood still, caught in the eye of the storm, surrounded by her family, yet utterly alone. The package in her purse seemed to grow heavier, its weight pressing down on her as though daring her to reveal the truth she carried. But what good would truth do in a room already poisoned against her? "I'm sorry," she whispered at last, not knowing if the words were meant for Sophia, for Richard, or for herself. She turned away, each step measured, her dignity the only possession she could still claim. Behind her, laughter rose again, music filled the hall, and the party resumed as though she had never been there at all. In her car, her hands trembled against the steering wheel. For a fleeting moment, she considered disappearing from their lives entirely, vanishing so the lies would remain unchallenged, untested. Perhaps that would be easier for everyone. But then her eyes drifted to her purse, to the small package containing the letter Richard had written and the sapphire brooch meant for their granddaughter. Proof, truth, a weapon, or perhaps a gift. When she returned to her apartment, silence wrapped around her like a shroud. She slipped off the blue dress that had felt like armor and now felt like a costume, nothing more than a failed performance in a play where her role had already been cut. She placed the package on the side table without opening it. "You old resentful woman," she whispered, repeating the cruel words that had hung above her like a curse. The photograph of Richard caught her gaze from the bookshelf, his gentle smile, the laugh lines at the corners of his eyes, the silver at his temples before cancer stole him away a decade earlier. Everything had changed after his death. Everything had unraveled. "They have poisoned her against me, Richard," she murmured into the stillness. "Our own granddaughter." Tears slid down her cheeks as memories pulled her backward, to the vineyard, to the betrayals that had left her here, an outcast in her own family, clutching only silence and truth. The photograph of Richard lingered in Margaret Hale's mind long after she whispered to it, long after the apartment fell quiet around her. 10 years had passed since he died, yet the wound remained raw, sharper on nights like this. She closed her eyes, and the memories pulled her under, sweeping her back to the days when grief was fresh, when she still believed family could survive loss without breaking. In the beginning, she had been grateful when Daniel stepped into the vineyard. Richard had always intended that she and their son would manage it together when the time came, allowing her to ease slowly toward the retirement. But when Richard's absence hollowed her out, she let Daniel take the lead. For a while, it seemed natural. She needed time to grieve. Daniel, ambitious and eager, embraced the responsibility. But when Margaret tried to return to her role, she discovered that the vineyard had shifted beneath her feet. Meetings she once scheduled were suddenly rescheduled without her knowledge. Financial reports arrived incomplete, vague, as if rewritten for her eyes only. Staff who had once been loyal to her and Richard avoided her gaze, their smiles brittle, their answers evasive. "You should rest, Mother," Daniel told her with rehearsed tenderness. "The stress isn't good for you." His concern had sounded genuine at first. She wanted to believe he was protecting her from burdens she wasn't ready to shoulder. But suspicion took root the night she sat at her desk, comparing invoices to shipping records, and realized the numbers did not align. Wine shipments vanished without accounting. Profits fell short of sales. New equipment appeared in the ledgers, purchased at staggering prices from companies she had never heard of. For weeks she pored over the details in secret, hoping she was mistaken, praying she was wrong. But the evidence grew undeniable. When she finally confronted Daniel in his office, she brought her papers neatly stacked, highlighted, impossible to ignore. He glanced at them, then at her, his expression tinged with something she would later recognize as pity. "These are complex matters, Mother," he explained slowly, as if speaking to a child. "Dad shielded you from the complicated parts of the business. These numbers look suspicious only because you don't understand modern management." Margaret's voice had trembled, not with weakness, but with fury. I ran this vineyard with your father for 30 years. I understand perfectly. Daniel's eyes hardened. Perhaps grief is clouding your judgment more than you realize. That was when Victoria began her campaign. Subtle at first, whispers cut short when Margaret entered a room, sympathetic glances that masked calculation. Later came the sharper blows, family dinners where she was left out of the conversation, school events she learned about after they had passed. "Oh, we thought you weren't feeling well enough to come," Victoria would say with sweet cruelty, her tone dripping with false concern. The final cut came the night Margaret overheard her daughter-in-law in the kitchen speaking to a sister-in-law who looked both alarmed and fascinated. "We're worried about Margaret," Victoria murmured. "Daniel had to remove her from the accounts. She keeps imagining conspiracies, seeing shadows where there are none. The doctor says it might be early dementia." Margaret had stood frozen in the doorway, blood roaring in her ears. There was no doctor. There were no medical concerns beyond the ones Victoria had invented. The lie spread quickly, cementing itself in the family's collective memory until Margaret's protests sounded like proof of madness rather than truth. When she confronted them that evening, her anger finally uncoiled after months of restraint. Daniel only shook his head, sorrow written across his face as if her fury proved his case. "See?" Victoria whispered to him, loud enough for Margaret to hear. "This is exactly what we feared." She left the vineyard that night. She carried nothing but her dignity, leaving behind the business she had built alongside Richard, the trust of her community, the closeness of her family. Every step away felt like exile. For years she told herself it was temporary, that the truth would surface on its own. But temporary stretched into permanence, and silence calcified into a new story. A story where Margaret Hale had abandoned her family out of resentment, bitterness, weakness. Alone in her small apartment now, she wiped at tears she had sworn not to shed anymore. She was tired of weeping for what had been stolen. Her gaze fell to the small package resting on the side table. Inside, wrapped in fading paper, was Richard's final gift. A sapphire brooch that had belonged to Margaret's grandmother, and an envelope sealed with her husband's handwriting. She had opened it once years ago, the night despair threatened to drown her. Richard's words had been both comfort and burden. He had written of his fears about Daniel's ambition, of Victoria's influence, of the secrets they had kept too long. He had urged Margaret to protect herself, leaving instructions about documents stored in a safe deposit box, evidence that could expose Daniel's mismanagement. And then, buried near the end, a revelation so heavy she had hidden it even from herself. Eduardo, he had written, Daniel, the boy they raised, was not their biological son. Catherine, Margaret's troubled sister, had left the infant in their care when she could no longer fight her addictions. Margaret and Richard had taken him in, loved him as their own, and never spoke of it again. Not after Catherine died, not even when Daniel grew into a man who resented the very woman who had once cradled him to sleep. Margaret touched the package now, her fingers trembling. She had guarded Richard's secret for more than 3 decades, believing love mattered more than blood. But seeing Sophia's eyes filled with mistrust at the party, hearing her parrot words that were never her own, Margaret wondered if silence had been a mistake. "Was I wrong, Richard?" she whispered to the photograph on the shelf. "Was I wrong to protect him, even as he stripped everything away from me?" The package sat still, pulsing with potential. It was more than a gift. It was a weapon. It was truth itself. And Margaret knew that using it would cross a line she had avoided all these years. But after Sophia's cold rejection, after hearing her granddaughter call her a stranger, a bitter intruder, Margaret felt something shift inside her. Perhaps the time for silence had ended. Perhaps it was time for the truth, no matter how much it burned. 3 weeks passed after the humiliation of Sophia's birthday. Margaret Hale buried herself in her quiet routines, clinging to the small comforts that dulled the sharp edges of loneliness. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, she volunteered at the community center. Sundays, she met her old friend Eleanor Price for coffee, grateful for a voice that did not carry suspicion or judgment. At home, she tended her balcony garden, coaxing life out of herbs and flowers, letting the green fill a silence that no family laughter touched anymore. Still, the ache lingered. Even with her hands in soil, even with Eleanor's easy laughter, Margaret could not shake the image of her granddaughter's face, hard, cold, rehearsed, delivering words that had not come from her own heart. One afternoon, while browsing Landre's antiques, she allowed herself a brief escape. The shop had always been a kind of refuge, a quiet maze of stories sealed in porcelain cups, worn jewelry, and photographs of strangers smiling through faded decades. She trailed her fingers across a delicate teacup, white porcelain etched with faint gold, when a voice behind her nearly stopped her breath. "Grandma?" The single word struck deeper than any accusation she had heard weeks before. Margaret turned slowly, afraid she had imagined it. But there she was, Sophia, standing just a few feet away. The girl's dark hair was pulled back into a neat ponytail, her frame wrapped in a simple sweater and jeans. Gone was the princess of the party, adorned in silk and surrounded by friends. This was a young woman stripped of pretense, hesitant yet real. Margaret's throat tightened. "Sophia," she whispered, setting the teacup down before her trembling hands could shatter it. "What are you doing here?" "School project." Sophia shifted her weight awkwardly, glancing around the shop as if to make sure no one else had heard about her. "We're supposed to find an object that represents our family history and write about it. Mom suggested I check antique stores." Of course she had. Victoria would sooner send her daughter wandering through strangers' relics than guide her through the boxes of heirlooms sitting untouched in Margaret's own apartment. Memories discarded as though history itself could be erased. "That sounds like an interesting project," Margaret said carefully, forcing her voice to remain steady. She dared not sound too eager, not when Sophia's guards still lingered. Sophia shrugged. "I don't know what I'm looking for." The silence stretched thin between them, as fragile as the porcelain cup. Margaret's heart ached to speak, to mention Richard's pocket watch, her mother's hand mirror, the photographs spanning generations. But she bit her tongue, afraid that too much hope might send Sophia retreating. "What kind of history are you hoping to showcase?" she asked instead, her tone gentle. Sophia traced her finger along the edge of a wooden table. "Something about where we came from, I guess. Dad says our family built everything from nothing." She hesitated, then glanced up, her eyes questioning. "But some of the old photographs at home show more than nothing." Hope flickered in Margaret's chest, small but fierce. "Your great-grandparents came from Spain in 1935, she said softly. "They brought almost nothing with them, but they carried knowledge about winemaking and determination that never faltered. That's what built our vineyard." Sophia looked at her fully for the first time. "You know a lot about them." "I do," Margaret replied simply. "I have letters, photographs, even keepsakes they carried across the ocean. Pieces of their lives." Sophia bit her lip. "Dad doesn't talk much about the past." "The past can be complicated," Margaret offered, cautious not to cast judgment. "Sometimes people prefer to focus only on the present." Sophia nodded faintly, then glanced at her watch. "I should go. My friend's mom is picking me up soon." Margaret mastered disappointment with a smile. "Of course. It was nice to see you, Sophia." The girl turned to leave, then paused, her body half turned back. "Do you really have things from our family history?" Margaret's pulse quickened. "Yes," she said, her voice low but certain. "Photographs, letters, heirlooms. You're welcome to see them anytime." Sophia hesitated, then pulled her phone from her pocket. "What's your number? For the project, I mean." Margaret's hands shook slightly as she recited the digits. She barely believed it herself until Sophia nodded, entered the number, and tucked the phone away. "I'll think about it," she said quietly, then slipped out of the shop. Margaret stood frozen in the still air of the antique store, afraid to move as if she might shatter the fragile bridge that had just formed. That evening, over tea in her small apartment, she told Eleanor what had happened. The sealed envelope with Richard's letter remained in the desk drawer nearby, its weight a constant reminder of the truth she carried. "This might be your chance," Eleanor said, her eyes bright with hope. "A chance to rebuild something with your granddaughter." "Or it might be nothing," Margaret replied, her voice tight with caution. "She might never call. Worse, she might tell Daniel and Victoria she saw me, and they'll make sure it never happens again." Eleanor set her cup down firmly. "Stop. You can't control what they'll do, Margaret. You can only decide how to respond. If she reaches out, Give her stories, small truths. Don't start with dynamite. Margaret nodded, knowing her friend was right. Richard's letter was too powerful to begin with. It was not a foundation, it was a fracture. To wield it recklessly would make her no better than Victoria, who used manipulation as currency. The chime of Margaret's phone broke the moment. She reached for it, her hands trembling. The message on the screen blurred until she blinked away tears. Unknown number. Hi, Grandma. This is Sophia. Could I come see those family photos sometime for my project? Margaret handed the phone to Eleanor with a disbelieving laugh that cracked into sobs. You see, Eleanor whispered, squeezing her arm, the bridge is small, but it's real. Margaret typed her reply carefully, each word a prayer. I'd love that, Sophia. You're welcome anytime. As she pressed send, her eyes drifted to the drawer that held Richard's final letter. Its truth would have its time, but not yet. First, there needed to be trust. First, there needed to be love strong enough to carry the weight of what was still hidden. Saturday arrived with a nervous anticipation Margaret Hale had not felt in years. The morning passed in a haze of preparation, her movements both careful and restless. She arranged old photo albums neatly on the coffee table, polished the frame of Richard's portrait, and baked a tray of lemon cookies, the very ones Sophia had loved as a little girl, back when visits were filled with flower-dusted laughter rather than silence. When the doorbell finally rang, Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She smoothed her skirt, steadied her trembling hands, and opened the door. Sophia stood in the hallway, backpack slung over one shoulder, her expression cautious but curious. She looked younger than she had at the party, stripped of the rehearsed anger, though uncertainty still shadowed her eyes. Hi, she said softly. Come in, Margaret replied, stepping aside with a smile that trembled at the edges. I'm so glad you came. Sophia entered slowly, her gaze sweeping the small apartment. Margaret wondered what she saw, an unfamiliar space, or faint echoes of the grandmother she had nearly forgotten. It's nice, Sophia said after a pause, setting her backpack down. Smaller than I expected. I don't need much these days, Margaret answered gently, leading her toward the living room. Would you like a cookie? I baked them this morning. Sophia's eyes flickered with recognition as she looked at the plate. You used to make those when I was little. It was not a question, but a memory surfacing. Every Sunday, Margaret said softly, you would sit on the stool at the counter and help me squeeze the lemons. For a moment, the girl's expression softened, though she quickly glanced toward the coffee table. Are those the family photos? Yes, Margaret said, sitting beside her on the sofa with enough space between them to allow comfort. She opened the oldest album, her hands steady now with purpose. This one begins with your great-great-grandparents in Spain before they came to America. Together they turned the pages, sepia-toned faces gazing back through time. Stern men in worn coats, women with proud eyes, children with solemn expressions, all standing before the original vineyard in Catalonia. There was the ship's manifest documenting their passage across the ocean. There was the first deed to a modest plot of California soil, signed in careful handwriting that carried hope across generations. Sophia leaned closer, studying the details with genuine interest. Occasionally, she jotted notes in her small notebook. When they reached photographs of her father as a boy, Sophia lingered, her finger brushing the image of a young Daniel grinning in the vineyard fields. Dad never shows me pictures like this, she said quietly. Margaret chose her words carefully. Some people find it easier to look ahead rather than back. Or maybe they're hiding something, Sophia muttered under her breath. Margaret pretended not to hear, turning the page to a photograph of herself and Richard standing proudly in front of the expanded vineyard, Daniel a teenager at their side. That was when we grew from 20 acres to 50, Margaret explained. Your grandfather had such vision for what the land could become. Sophia studied the photograph. Dad says he built the business into what it is now. He told me Grandpa Richard was too cautious, too old-fashioned. The words stung, but Margaret kept her expression calm. Your grandfather believed in steady growth, in learning the land before expanding. Your father brought in new approaches. Both ways had value. Sophia frowned. But it looks successful already. These pictures don't show a struggling vineyard. Margaret's heart lifted at her granddaughter's insight. Yes, she said softly, it was successful. Different, but successful. They moved through the albums slowly, the afternoon sunlight spilling across the pages. Sophia's notes grew longer, her questions sharper. When they reached photographs of her own childhood, her breath caught. There she was, a toddler in Margaret's arms, flour on her cheeks as they baked together. Another image showed her perched on Richard's shoulders among the grapevines, laughter frozen in time. "I don't remember any of this," Sophia whispered. "You were very young when things changed," Margaret answered carefully. Sophia looked up, her eyes searching. "Why did you leave us?" The question landed like a stone, heavy and inevitable. Margaret drew in a slow breath. "I didn't leave, Sophia. I was pushed away." Her granddaughter's brows knit together. "Mom and Dad said you couldn't handle Dad taking over, that you were bitter, interfering." Margaret's voice wavered but did not break. "After your grandfather died, I discovered troubling issues with the vineyard's finances. When I brought them to your father, he and your mother told others I was confused, even unstable. Soon I was excluded from everything, decisions, gatherings, even your life." Sophia's expression grew uncertain. "That's not what the day told me." "I imagine it isn't," Margaret said softly. "But look at these photographs. Do they show a woman who would abandon her family willingly?" Sophia stared at a picture of herself at 5 years old, sitting on Margaret's lap beside a glittering Christmas tree. Her lips pressed together as if she were weighing truths too heavy for her age. "I don't know what to believe." "I don't expect you to take my word over theirs," Margaret said gently. "I only hope you will consider that there are two sides to every story." Sophia nodded slowly, then her phone buzzed. She glanced down and Margaret saw her expression tighten. "I have to go. My mom's asking where I am." "Did you tell her you were coming here?" Margaret asked softly, though she already knew the answer. "No," Sophia admitted, shoving her notebook back into her bag. "I said I was at the library." Margaret helped her gather her things, her heart heavy with both fear and hope. At the door, Sophia hesitated. "Can I come back? There's still a lot I don't know." "Any time," Margaret said, her voice warm with both joy and restraint. "My door is always open to you." After the door closed, Margaret sank onto the sofa, surrounded by albums and fading laughter. She had been careful, offering memories, not accusations, letting photographs whisper truths that words could not. But as she stared at the empty space Sophia had left behind, Margaret wondered if it would be enough to undo years of poison. The doorbell rang just after dusk, sharp and insistent. Margaret Hale rose from her chair, her heart already sinking, with the certainty that this was not a neighbor stopping by. When she opened the door, Daniel stood before her, his jaw tight with fury, Victoria just behind him with tears brimming in her eyes but none falling. "Mother," Daniel said, his voice low and controlled, the way he always sounded when he wanted to project authority, "we need to talk about your manipulation of Sophia." Margaret steadied herself, her fingers curling against the doorframe. "I haven't manipulated anyone. Sophia came to me for help with her school project." Victoria's laugh was sharp, brittle, the sound of glass shattering. "A project? Is that what you're calling it?" "She came home asking why we never show her old photographs of the vineyard, why we never talk about the past. Do you think we don't know where those ideas came from?" Margaret kept her voice calm, though her pulse thundered in her ears. "She wanted to see her family history. I showed her albums. That's all." Daniel stepped closer, his face inches from hers. "Stay away from her. Whatever game you're playing, it stops now." "It isn't a game to want a relationship with my granddaughter," Margaret replied, meeting his glare with steady eyes. "And it wasn't a game when you pushed me out of the business your father and I built together." His expression hardened, old anger surfacing like a wound ripped open. "You're still the same bitter woman you've always been, clinging to grievances, inventing conspiracies." For a moment, Margaret almost turned toward her desk, almost reached for the envelope tucked inside, the letter Richard had left behind. It would end this charade once and for all. But then she saw Sophia's face in her mind, young and questioning, fragile with hope. "No, not yet. If Sophia doesn't want to see me, I'll respect that," Margaret said quietly. "But if she reaches out, I will not turn her away." Daniel's jaw tightened like a steel trap. "We've forbidden her to contact you. If you approach her again, we'll take legal action." Victoria's hand slipped into his arm, her expression cold, triumphant. Without another word, they turned and walked away, leaving Margaret in the silence of her doorway. The threat hung in the air like smoke. That night, as Margaret lay awake replaying every cutting word, her phone vibrated on the nightstand. She sat up quickly, her heart thudding. The message came from an unfamiliar number. "They took my phone, but I'm using my friends. They're so angry about me seeing you. Dad said terrible things. I don't understand why they hate you so much. I need to know the truth. Can we still talk somehow?" Margaret pressed a trembling hand to her lips. Hope flared where fear had just burned. The bridge between them had not collapsed. It was fragile, dangerous, but still standing. For the next 2 weeks, she and Sophia carried on their secret conversations, the girl borrowing her friends' phones to send messages. They arranged to meet at the public library, a place she could be without arousing suspicion. Each time, Margaret brought more photographs, more stories, fragments of a heritage Sophia had been denied. She was careful never to speak ill of Daniel or Victoria. She let Sophia ask her own questions, draw her own conclusions. And Sophia, bright and perceptive, began to notice cracks in the story she had been told. "There's something they're not telling me," Sophia said one afternoon, her voice low with frustration as they sat at a corner table. "Dad gets so angry whenever I mention your name. It's not normal." "Family dynamics can be complicated," Margaret answered carefully, though her chest ached with the weight of what she held back. "It's more than that," Sophia pressed. "Last night I heard them arguing. Mom said, 'What if she tells Sophia everything?' What does that even mean? Everything." Margaret's breath caught. Richard's letter burned in her memory, heavy as a stone. Still, she hesitated. "Sometimes adults carry secrets they believe will protect their children," she said softly. "Or themselves." Sophia's eyes searched hers. "You know something too, don't you? Something you haven't told me." Before Margaret could answer, her phone rang, Daniel's name flashing across the screen. Her stomach dropped. "It's your father," she whispered. "Don't answer," Sophia pleaded, her face pale. The call ended, replaced instantly by a text. "We know Sophia is with you. If you don't bring her home immediately, we're calling the police." Margaret showed the message to her granddaughter. Fear flashed across Sophia's face. "How did they know?" "They probably tracked your friend's phone," Margaret said, helping her gather the photo albums quickly. "It's not fair," Sophia said, her voice cracking. "Why can't I know my own grandmother? Why are they so desperate to keep us apart?" The question hung between them, unanswered, the truth locked away in a drawer back at the apartment. Margaret's decision came swiftly, almost on instinct, though it felt inevitable. "Come home with me for a moment," she said quietly. "Before I take you back, there's something you should see." 10 minutes later, they stood in Margaret's apartment, the air charged with urgency. Margaret went straight to her desk and unlocked the drawer that had guarded Richard's final gift for so many years. "What's that?" Sophia asked, her eyes wide as Margaret lifted a small package wrapped in worn paper. "Something your grandfather wanted you to have someday," Margaret said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I've been keeping it safe until the time was right." Margaret placed the small package on the desk, her fingers brushing its worn edges as though it were alive. For years she had guarded it, never daring to unwrap it, never daring to cross the line Richard had drawn with his final words. Now, with Sophia standing in her living room, her young eyes filled with both fear and longing, Margaret knew the moment had arrived. She peeled back the paper slowly, her breath catching as the contents emerged. A small velvet box in a sealed envelope, its flap yellowed with time, but untouched. She opened the box first, revealing a sapphire brooch set in silver, the deep blue stone catching the light like fire caught in water. Sophia gasped softly, reaching out. "It's beautiful." "It belonged to my grandmother," Margaret said, her voice hushed. "Then to me. It was meant for your Aunt Laura, my daughter, but she passed before she could receive it. Richard wanted it to go to you instead when you were old enough." Sophia's brows furrowed. "But Dad told me all the family jewelry went missing after Grandpa died." "Well, nothing went missing," Margaret said gently. "Everything was kept safe." She held out the envelope, but this too. Sophia's hands trembled as she broke the seal and unfolded the letter. Margaret watched her granddaughter's lips move silently at first, tracing Richard's handwriting, until the words slipped aloud into the room. "My dearest Margaret, If you are reading this, then I am no longer beside you. I am sorry for that burden. I've seen the changes in Daniel, the ambition that consumes him, the influence Victoria holds over him. I fear that once I am gone, he will try to take everything we built together. I have secured copies of all documents in the safe deposit box. Use them if needed to protect yourself. But there is a truth heavier than numbers, one we have carried in silence for too long. Sophia's voice faltered, her eyes lifting to Margaret before she forced herself to continue. Daniel is not our biological son. Catherine, your sister, left him with us when he was only 3 months old. Her struggles with addiction left her unable to care for him. We took him in, loved him as our own, and after she passed, we never spoke of it again. No one else knows. I never wanted him to feel unwanted. Perhaps if he knew the truth, he might understand that what matters is love, not blood. Sophia's hand dropped, the paper trembling in her grasp. Tears filled her eyes, spilling freely down her cheeks. That means Dad isn't really... Margaret leaned forward, her voice steady and firm. He is your father, Sophia, and he was our son in every way that matters. Richard and I loved him as though he were born of us. Sophia's breath came in uneven waves. Then why keep this secret? Why tell me now? Margaret sat beside her, the weight of decades pressing on her shoulders. We kept it because we wanted him to feel secure, never different. But I'm telling you now because you deserve to know the truth of your family, and because I cannot bear to see lies twist you against me. Sophia stared at the letter and then at the brooch lying in her palm. Her young face carried the weight of understanding far beyond her years. Dad doesn't know, does he, that he was adopted? Margaret shook her head slowly. Richard and I agreed we would only tell him if it became absolutely necessary. We thought silence was love. Perhaps we were wrong. Sophia's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes distant. And you think this is necessary now, to tell me something that could destroy him? The question struck Margaret like a blade. She reached for Sophia's hand, gently closing her fingers around the brooch. I only want you to see that the story they've told about me, that I abandoned this family, isn't true. I never walked away. I was forced out when I questioned things I wasn't supposed to question. The girl looked at her grandmother with a mixture of sorrow and defiance. This changes everything. Before Margaret could answer, Sophia's phone buzzed again, insistent, her father's name lighting up the screen again and again. The sound filled the room like a warning bell. Sophia slipped the letter back into the envelope, her movements careful, reverent. She placed both it and the brooch into her backpack. They'll be furious, she whispered. Keep them, Margaret said firmly. They belong to you now. Sophia hesitated at the doorway, her face pale, her shoulders squared under a weight too heavy for 15 years. I don't know what to do with this, she admitted. You don't have to do anything, Margaret said softly. The truth doesn't demand action. It only asks to be known. Sophia gave a small nod, then disappeared into the night, leaving Margaret alone in the stillness of the apartment. Margaret stood at the window, her chest aching as she watched her granddaughter walk toward the car. The truth was out now, alive and breathing in Sophia's hands. Whether it would break them all or bind them closer, Margaret could not yet know. The drive back to Daniel and Victoria's house was silent, the weight of Richard's letter heavy between them. Margaret's hands gripped the steering wheel, her sighing fixed on the road while Sophia clutched her backpack tightly, as though the contents inside were both a burden and a shield. When Margaret parked at the curb, she turned to her granddaughter. Do you want me to go in with you? She asked gently. Sophia shook her head, her young face solemn. I think I need to do this myself. Margaret hesitated. You don't have to tell them about the letter. Not today. Not ever if you don't want to. Sophia's gaze met hers, startlingly clear. Keeping secrets is what broke this family apart. I don't want it to be part of that anymore. Before Margaret could respond, the front door flew open. Daniel stormed out, his face dark with fury, Victoria hovering behind him, arms crossed in rigid defiance. Where have you been? Daniel's voice cracked through the night, low but trembling with anger. Sophia stepped out of the car, her backpack clutched like armor. At Grandma's, she said, her voice trembling but strong. Daniel strode toward her, seizing her arm. We told you to stay away from her. Let go of her, Daniel. Margaret's voice rang out across the yard, steadier than she felt. He spun toward her, eyes blazing. Haven't you done enough? Stay out of this. If you're going to be angry, Margaret said, stepping closer, be angry with me, not with her. She only wanted to understand her family. There's nothing to understand, Victoria snapped, moving onto the lawn, her voice sharp as a blade. Except that you can't accept you're not wanted. Sophia pulled her arm free, her chin lifting with sudden resolve. She unzipped her backpack, pulled out the old envelope, and held it up with both hands. I found out why you really hate Grandma, she said, her voice shaking but determined. It's not because she abandoned us. It's because she knows things you didn't want her to know. Daniel froze, his eyes fixed on the envelope as if it were a weapon. What is that? What has she been telling you? The truth, Margaret said softly. Give me that, Daniel demanded, reaching for the letter. Sophia stepped back, holding it to her chest. No, this was written by Grandpa Richard. It was meant for me. Victoria's composure finally cracked, her face twisting. You had no right to interfere in our family. I am this family, Margaret said, her voice breaking with years of swallowed pain. I helped build everything you now claim as yours, Daniel. I loved you from the moment Catherine placed you in my arms, and I never stopped, even when you pushed me away. Daniel's expression faltered, confusion piercing his rage. What are you talking about? When Catherine placed me, Sophia thrust the letter toward him. Read it. Read what Grandpa wrote before he died. Daniel's hands shook as he tore the envelope open. Victoria leaned in close, her eyes scanning the page with him. As the words sank in, color drained from both their faces. This isn't true, Daniel whispered. His voice cracked, stripped of certainty. This can't be true. It is, Margaret said gently. Your biological mother was my sister, Catherine. She loved you, but she was too ill to care for you. Richard and I raised you as our own. We became your parents in every way that mattered. Daniel's eyes filled with something raw and wounded. Why didn't you tell me? Why keep this from me all these years? Because we thought we were protecting you, Margaret said. We wanted you to feel secure, never different. We wanted you to believe you belonged completely. He staggered back, his voice thick. So I'm not even a real Hale. The vineyard, the family legacy, none of it was truly mine. That isn't true, Margaret said, moving closer. You were our son. The vineyard was your birthright because we chose you, because we loved you. He shook his head, retreating. No, you lied to me my whole life. Victoria snatched the letter from his hands, her voice rising. This changes nothing. Biological or not, Daniel built that business into what it is today. Your husband's letter doesn't entitle you to anything. I never came back for the vineyard, Margaret said quietly. I came back for my family. Daniel looked at her, really looked, and for the first time in years she saw not anger, but grief. Why reveal this now? Was it just to hurt me? Margaret's heart splintered at the pain in his eyes. I kept the secret for 30 years. I revealed it now because the lies about me had poisoned everything. Even Sophia. I couldn't bear it anymore. Sophia stepped forward, pulling the sapphire brooch from her pocket. The stone caught the porch light, glowing like truth itself. Grandpa wanted me to have this. He wanted us to know the truth, not to hurt anyone, but so we could heal. Daniel's gaze softened as he looked at the brooch, recognition stirring. I remember that. You used to wear it on special occasions. Margaret nodded. It has been in our family for generations. It was meant for Laura, then for her daughter. But when we lost her, Richard and I chose to pass it to you, Sophia. A single tear slipped down Daniel's cheek, the first Margaret had seen since he was a boy. I don't know what to believe anymore. Believe this, Margaret said softly. You were loved by Richard, by me, even by Catherine in her own broken way. That is the truth that matters most. The night air seemed to still around them, the storm momentarily suspended. The truth had been spoken aloud, impossible to take back, impossible to ignore. The days that followed were heavy with silence. The truth had ripped through the Hale family like a storm, leaving Daniel raw and unsteady. For years he had lived with certainty, his place in the world defined by the vineyard, by the family name, by the story he believed was his own. Now, every certainty seemed fragile, every memory haunted by the question of what had been true and what had been concealed. Margaret heard nothing from him in the first week. She imagined him pacing the halls of his house, wrestling with Richard's words, clinging to anger because it was easier than grief. She pictured Victoria by his side, whispering, feeding his fury, urging him to see Margaret as the enemy who had ruined everything. But it was Sophia who reached out, quietly, carefully, her messages arriving late at night when the house was still. Dad won't talk to me. Mom keeps saying you only told me those things to turn me against them. But I know that letter was real. I know Grandpa wouldn't lie. Margaret's responses were measured, steady. Give him time, Sophia. Truth can feel like a wound at first, but wounds can heal. When Sophia finally appeared at her apartment again, her face was pale but determined. She sank into the old armchair across from Margaret, clutching the brooch at her throat. He's broken, Grandma. He doesn't say it, but I see it in his eyes. He doesn't know who he is anymore. Margaret leaned forward, her heart aching. He is who he has always been, my son. That hasn't changed. Sophia shook her head. He doesn't believe it. He thinks he's nothing now, like the vineyard isn't his, like the family name isn't his. Margaret's voice softened. The vineyard was his long before he knew where he came from. Richard and I gave it to him, not because of blood, but because of choice. He has always been ours. Sophia's eyes filled with tears. He needs to hear that from you, not from me. It was 2 more weeks before Daniel came. Sophia brought him, coaxing him with a firmness that surprised even Margaret. He stood at the doorway of her apartment, stiff, formal, his expression unreadable. Daniel, Margaret said quietly. He nodded, stepping inside as though crossing enemy territory. His eyes swept the modest living room, landing on the photo albums still stacked neatly on the coffee table. I'm not here to forgive, he said, his voice rough. I'm here because Sophia deserves to know her grandmother. Margaret swallowed her tears, offering a small nod. That's enough, for now. The visit was brief, awkward, dumb. He asked few questions, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his jacket, his gaze rarely meeting hers. But it was a start, a crack in the wall. After he left, Sophia lingered, her voice fierce with hope. He came, that means he can come again. In the weeks that followed, he did, slowly, haltingly, like a man learning how to breathe in a different kind of air. He asked about Catherine, his biological mother, questions that came in fragments, hesitant and sharp. What was she like? Margaret answered honestly, with neither cruelty nor embellishment. She was troubled, gentle at times, reckless at others. She wanted more than she could hold, but she loved you. Even when she couldn't care for you, she loved you. Sometimes he left abruptly, unable to hear more. Other times he stayed, flipping through photographs Margaret had kept hidden for decades. Pictures of him as an infant in her arms, of Richard cradling him with pride, of Catherine with haunted eyes standing in the background. Victoria, meanwhile, remained distant, her voice sharp whenever Margaret's name surfaced. But even she began to soften when she saw how important these meetings were to Sophia, how determined the girl was to mend what had been broken. It was Sophia who became the bridge, moving between them with a determination far beyond her years. She refused to accept silence as an answer, refused to let the fracture widen. She told her father plainly, "You don't have to forgive everything, but you can't erase her. She's part of us. She's part of me." Margaret marveled at her granddaughter's strength. Where she had once expected to be the one protecting Sophia, she realized Sophia was protecting her, defending her place in the family with a fierceness that only love could give. One evening, Daniel sat at Margaret's table, his posture rigid, his eyes downcast. I still don't know how to process it, he admitted. All those years, believing I was someone I wasn't. I don't know who I am anymore. Margaret reached across the table, her hand trembling as it rested gently over his. You are my son. You were always my son. That hasn't changed, and it never will. For the first time, he didn't pull away. The months that followed were neither easy nor simple. Conversations stalled, tensions flared. Margaret caught Victoria's suspicious glances, the lingering distrust in her eyes. But there were also moments that held light, Sophia laughing at old photographs, Daniel asking about Richard's dreams for the vineyard, Margaret sharing memories she had locked away for too long. 6 months after that night on the lawn, an envelope arrived in Margaret's mailbox. Inside was an invitation, dinner at Daniel and Victoria's home. Her hands shook as she held it, tears welling in her eyes. It was not forgiveness, not complete acceptance, but it was an opening, a seat at the table she had been barred from for so long. The night Margaret walked up the stone path to Daniel and Victoria's house, her heart pounded like a drum in her chest. The glow of warm light spilled through the tall windows, softening the sharp edges of her fear. For years she had walked away from this doorway with bitterness clinging to her, but tonight she returned by invitation. She clutched the sapphire brooch at her collar, as though Richard himself walked beside her. The door opened before she could knock. Sophia stood there, radiant with a smile that reached her eyes. "Grandma," she whispered, her voice tight with excitement and relief. She reached for Margaret's hand, guiding her inside. The dining room was already set, the table dressed in white linen, candles flickering, silver polished to a high gleam. Daniel stood at the far end, his posture straight, but his expression unsettled. Victoria lingered beside him, composed but tense, her arms folded as if holding herself together. "Mother," Daniel said. The word was clipped, but it was a word he had refused her for years. "Daniel," Margaret replied softly, her throat tightening. She looked at him not as the adversary who had cast her out, but as the boy she had raised, the man who had carried both her love and her silence. For a long moment no one moved. Then Sophia pulled out a chair near the middle of the table. "Sit here, Grandma," she urged. Margaret hesitated, her hand brushing the back of the chair. It felt like a threshold, a bridge between exile and belonging. Slowly she lowered herself into the seat. Dinner began stiffly. Conversation was polite, sparse. Victoria asked about the weather, Daniel about Margaret's health, but beneath their words ran an undercurrent. Pain, suspicion, longing that no small talk could hide. It was Sophia who broke the silence. She set down her fork, her voice firm but gentle. "We can't pretend everything's normal, but we can't go on living like enemies either. I'm tired of feeling like I'm split in two every time I walk into this house. I love you, Dad. I love you, Mom. And I love Grandma. I shouldn't have to choose." Her words hung in the air, trembling with the weight of truth. Daniel's eyes softened as he looked at his daughter, his lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. Margaret felt the urge to reach across the table, but she stayed still, waiting, her chest aching with hope. Finally, Daniel drew a deep breath. His voice was low and steady. "I don't know how to move past what's been revealed. It feels like the ground under me has shifted. But," his eyes met Margaret's, "you were there from the beginning. You raised me. That much I cannot deny." Tears filled Margaret's eyes. She forced herself to stay calm, to let him speak without pressing, without pleading. "I don't forgive everything," Daniel continued, his voice rough, "but I'm willing to try. For Sophia, for the family." Victoria shifted beside him, her jaw tight, but she said nothing. Instead, she reached for Daniel's hand, lacing her fingers with his. The candles flickered, and for the first time in years, Margaret felt warmth return to the space between them. It was fragile, delicate as glass, but it was there. As the meal went on, conversation grew easier. They spoke of the vineyard, of Sophia's school projects, of memories that once would have been too painful to touch. Margaret told a story of Richard teaching young Daniel to prune the vines, and though Daniel's smile was faint, it was real. Later, when plates were cleared and the evening wound down, Sophia leaned against her grandmother, her head resting lightly on Margaret's shoulder. "See," she whispered, "we're starting over." Margaret pressed a kiss to her hair, her voice breaking. "Yes, sweetheart, we are." When she rose to leave, Daniel walked her to the door. The night air was cool, scented faintly with the vines that stretched beyond the house. He hesitated, his eyes shadowed with conflict. "Thank you for coming," he said at last. The words were stiff, but they carried sincerity. "Thank you for asking me," Margaret replied. For a moment, it felt as though Richard himself stood between them, his presence woven through the vineyard, Through the memories, through the family, they were struggling to piece back together. Margaret stepped into the night with tears on her cheeks, but for the first time in years, they were not born of grief. They were tears of release, of possibility, of love that had endured even the sharpest betrayals. The road ahead would not be smooth. Old wounds would reopen, trust would falter, and the weight of truth would never fully disappear. But tonight had proven something Margaret had almost stopped believing. Reconciliation was possible. As she walked down the path toward her car, the brooch glimmered at her collar, catching the moonlight. She touched it gently, whispering into the night, as if Richard could hear her still. "We made it back, love. Somehow we found our way back." And so the Hales began again, not with perfect forgiveness, but with the fragile courage to face one another honestly. Margaret knew the past could never be erased, but she also knew that love, tested by fire, could be remade. If this story has touched you, share it with others who believe in the power of truth and family. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that stir the heart and remind us that even in the darkest hours, love can endure.